The dust settled over Redemption Creek like a blanket, golden particles dancing in the late afternoon sunlight that slanted between the weathered buildings. Mason Blackwood sat on the porch of the town's only hotel, his weathered fingers working methodically to clean the Colt revolver that had seen him through 20 years of frontier justice. At 53, the lines on his face told stories of harsh winters, relentless summers, and the kind of decisions most men would never have to make. His silver-streaked dark hair hung just below his collar, and the shadow of a beard framed a jaw that rarely softened. The townsfolk of Redemption Creek gave Mason a wide berth, not out of disrespect, but out of a reverence reserved for men who had survived what the West had thrown at them and emerged standing. Hey there, friends. If you're enjoying this story, I'd be mighty obliged if you'd consider subscribing to the channel. I put a lot of heart into these tales of the Old West. I'm curious, what part of the country are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments below. Mason had been the town's sheriff for nearly a decade, stepping in after the previous lawman had been gunned down by cattle rustlers. Before that, he'd ridden with the Texas Rangers, tracked outlaws across 5 territories, and even spent 3 years as a shotgun messenger for Wells Fargo. The badge on his chest was worn around the edges, much like the man who wore it. His reputation preceded him: fair but unforgiving, methodical but swift when justice demanded it. The saloon owner, Thomas Sullivan, often remarked that Mason was the human equivalent of a thunderstorm, quiet in approach, devastating in delivery, and cleansing in aftermath. "Sheriff Blackwood," called a voice from the dusty street, "telegram came for you." The young man from the telegraph office, barely 16 and eager to please, held out a yellow paper with trembling hands. Mason folded his cleaning cloth deliberately, tucking it into his vest pocket before accepting the message. The boy lingered, curiosity evident in his eyes, but one look from the sheriff sent him scurrying back toward the telegraph office. Mason unfolded the paper, his gray eyes scanning the words with practiced efficiency. His expression remained unchanged, but something in his posture shifted, a tensing in the shoulders, a subtle straightening of the spine that suggested the message carried weight. Inside the hotel's modest restaurant, Elizabeth Montgomery arranged wildflowers in small glass jars, her delicate hands working with precision that belied her gentle appearance. At 38, she was the town's schoolteacher, widow to a man who died in a mining accident 5 years prior. Her auburn hair was pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, tendrils escaping to frame a face that had retained its beauty despite the hardships of frontier life. Unlike most of the townspeople, Elizabeth approached Mason without the usual caution, treating him with a warmth that had, over time, created a tentative friendship between them. She glanced out the window, noticing the change in his demeanor as he read the telegram, and made a mental note to inquire about it later. The sun continued its descent behind the distant mountains, casting long shadows across Redemption Creek. Mason refolded the telegram, tucking it into his shirt pocket before rising from his chair. His movement was deliberate, unhurried, as he collected his hat from the table beside him. The weight of his gun belt shifted against his hip as he stepped down from the porch, boots raising small clouds of dust with each footfall. His destination was the sheriff's office, a modest building with barred windows and a solid oak door that had withstood its fair share of attempted breakouts. Inside, he would make preparations, for the telegram had brought news he'd been both expecting and dreading. Silas Turner had escaped from Yuma Territorial Prison. Mason's history with Silas Turner stretched back 15 years, to a blood-soaked day in a small Texas town when Turner and his gang had attempted to rob the local bank. Mason, then riding with the Rangers, had arrived just as the robbery turned deadly. In the ensuing shootout, Turner had killed two of Mason's fellow Rangers before taking a young woman hostage, Rebecca Collins, the schoolteacher much like Elizabeth, but with golden hair and eyes the color of cornflowers. What happened next had haunted Mason through countless sleepless nights. Rebecca, sensing Turner's momentary distraction, had attempted to break free. The outlaw's response was instinctual and deadly, a knife across her throat before anyone could intervene. Mason had put a bullet in Turner's shoulder, ending the standoff, but too late to save Rebecca. The trial had been swift, the sentence expected, hanging until dead. But influential connections and a silver-tongued lawyer had seen the sentence commuted to life imprisonment at Yuma. Mason had watched, stone-faced, as Turner was led away, the outlaw's parting words burning into his memory. "I'll find you someday, Ranger, and you'll beg for the end." Now, 15 years later, Turner had made good on the first part of his promise. Mason had no intention of allowing him to fulfill the second. As he pushed open the door to his office, the familiar smell of gun oil, old paper, and wood smoke greeted him. This room had been his sanctuary and his prison for a decade, the place where justice was dispensed with careful consideration. Deputy Jonathan Wells looked up from his desk, his youthful face a stark contrast to Mason's weathered countenance. At 25, Jonathan had served as Mason's deputy for 3 years, learning the complexities of frontier law enforcement under the older man's tutelage. "Everything all right, Sheriff?" he inquired, noting the tension in his mentor's bearing. Mason handed him the telegram without comment, watching as Jonathan's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "Silas Turner," the young deputy whispered, the name carrying weight, even though he knew the man only through Mason's sparse recountings. "He'll come here, won't he? To Redemption Creek." "Like a moth to flame," Mason confirmed, his voice low and graveled from years of trail dust and whiskey. He moved to the gun cabinet, unlocking it with a key that never left his person. "Send word to the outlying ranches. Everyone needs to be on alert. Turner won't come alone. Never did operate that way." Jonathan nodded, already reaching for paper and pen to draft the necessary messages. Mason selected a Winchester rifle from the cabinet, checking its action with practiced hands. The rifle had been a constant companion during his Ranger days, as reliable as the rising sun. "And Jonathan," he added, pausing in his preparations, "make sure Miss Montgomery knows to keep the children indoors until further notice." The mention of Elizabeth's name caused a flicker of understanding to cross Jonathan's features. The entire town had noticed the careful dance between the sheriff and the schoolteacher, a courtship conducted through subtle gestures and conversations that never quite addressed what was growing between them. "I'll tell her myself," Jonathan assured him, sensing that Mason would prefer the warning to come with the gentleness the younger man could provide, rather than the stark reality that would accompany Mason's delivery. The sheriff nodded his appreciation, turning his attention back to his preparations. Somewhere out there, Silas Turner was making his way toward Redemption Creek, driven by a vendetta that had festered for 15 years. Mason intended to be ready when he arrived. As darkness claimed the town, lamps were lit in windows, and the saloon's piano came to life, its cheerful notes a counterpoint to the tension building within Mason. He completed his rounds, checking that the town was secure for the night, before climbing the stairs to his modest room above the sheriff's office. Sleep would be elusive, he knew, but he would need his wits about him in the days to come. He removed his hat and gun belt, placing them within easy reach of the narrow bed. The telegram lay on the small table, its message a harbinger of the storm approaching Redemption Creek. Mason Blackwood had faced many challenges in his years on the frontier, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Silas Turner's return would test him in ways he had yet to experience. The following morning dawned clear and crisp, the first hints of autumn evident in the cooler air. Mason had risen before the sun, checking and rechecking his weapons before descending to the office below. Jonathan arrived shortly after, bringing news that the messages had been delivered to the outlying ranches. "The Wilsons and Hendersons are sending men to help patrol," he reported, pouring coffee into tin cups for them both. "And I spoke with Miss Montgomery last night. She wasn't pleased about keeping the children indoors, but she understood the necessity." Mason nodded, accepting the coffee with a grunt of appreciation. Elizabeth's safety was paramount in his mind, though he'd never voiced this concern aloud. The door to the sheriff's office swung open, admitting Dr. Samuel Foster, the town's physician, and one of the few people Mason might consider a friend. At 60, the doctor had seen his share of frontier violence and had patched up Mason on more occasions than either cared to remember. "Heard about Turner," he said without preamble, helping himself to coffee. "Thought you might want to know that a stranger came in on the evening stage yesterday, took a room at the hotel, claimed to be a cattle buyer." Mason's gaze sharpened at this information. The timing was too convenient to be coincidence. "Description?" he asked. Setting aside his coffee, Dr. Foster leaned against the desk, his expression thoughtful. Mid-40s, well-dressed, city manners, carried a walking stick with a silver handle, seemed out of place for these parts. Mason exchanged a glance with Jonathan, both men recognizing the description. "Henry Wallace," Mason muttered, the name bringing back memories of Turner's gang. Wallace had been the planner, the one with the education and connections, who had escaped capture during that fateful bank robbery in Texas. If Wallace was in Redemption Creek, Turner wouldn't be far behind. "Keep an eye on him," Mason instructed Jonathan, "but don't let on that we know who he is. Let him think his cover is intact." The day unfolded with a deceptive normalcy. The citizens of Redemption Creek going about their business, unaware of the danger approaching their town. Mason maintained his usual rounds, his watchful gaze noting every detail, every unfamiliar face. He paused outside the schoolhouse, where Elizabeth had gathered the children in the yard for their midday break, rather than the usual excursion to the creek. She spotted him and crossed to the fence that separated them, concern evident in her features. "The children are disappointed about staying close to the school," she said by way of greeting, her voice carrying the soft lilt that always seemed to ease something in Mason's chest. "I told them it was because of coyotes spotted near town." "Thank you for understanding," Mason replied, his hat in his hands as he always held it when speaking with her. A sign of respect, Jonathan had once teased, that Mason showed to no one else in town. "It's just a precaution." Elizabeth studied his face, reading the tension there with the perception that had always unsettled and comforted him in equal measure. "This is about more than just an escaped prisoner, isn't it?" she asked quietly, mindful of the children playing nearby. Mason hesitated, unaccustomed to sharing the burdens he carried. But Elizabeth had a way of drawing truth from him that he usually kept buried. "The man who escaped, we have history, bad history, and he's made promises I aim to prevent him from keeping." Elizabeth's hand rested briefly on his arm, a touch so light he might have imagined it if not for the warmth that lingered after she withdrew. "Be careful, Mason," she said simply, using his given name as few in town dared to do. "Vengeance has a way of consuming those who pursue it, as well as those who provoke it." Her insight struck closer to home than she could know. Mason had spent 15 years trying to reconcile his failure to save Rebecca Collins, channeling his guilt into becoming the kind of lawman who prevented such tragedies. The possibility that his pursuit of justice might endanger Elizabeth or anyone else in Redemption Creek was a weight he could scarcely bear. "I'll be careful," he promised, settling his hat back on his head before continuing his rounds. As dusk approached, Mason positioned extra men around the town, focusing on the approaches that offered the best cover for anyone wishing to enter unseen. Jonathan had reported that Henry Wallace had spent most of the day in the saloon, engaging various townspeople in conversation that seemed designed to gather information. Particularly, Wallace had shown interest in the sheriff's habits and the town's defenses. Mason knew the pattern well. Wallace was scouting for Turner, preparing the ground for whatever plan the escaped convict had devised during his years behind bars. The question wasn't if Turner would come, but when and how. And most importantly, who else might be caught in the crossfire when he did? The answer came sooner than expected, in the form of a fire that erupted at the livery stable shortly after midnight. The flames lit up the night sky, drawing townspeople from their beds despite the late hour. Mason immediately recognized the diversion for what it was, but couldn't ignore the danger to the town if the fire spread. "Jonathan, organize a bucket line," he shouted over the growing chaos, his eyes scanning the crowd and the shadows beyond for signs of Turner or his accomplices. The stables were at the east end of town, drawing attention and manpower away from the west end, where the sheriff's office, the bank, and the hotel stood. Mason gestured to two of the ranchers who had volunteered to help patrol, directing them to maintain their positions while he investigated the western approach. His instincts proved correct. As he moved silently along the backs of buildings, Mason caught sight of 3 riders approaching slowly from the west, using the commotion at the livery stable as cover. In the moonlight, he couldn't make out faces, but the lead rider's posture was hauntingly familiar. The slight forward lean, the confident handling of the reins that had always marked Silas Turner's horsemanship. Mason pressed himself against the wall of the general store, calculating his options. He could attempt to intercept them now, but the odds were 3 against 1, and Turner had always been quick with a gun. The smarter play would be to let them enter town, alert Jonathan and the others, and confront the intruders on terms more favorable to the defenders. As he prepared to double back toward the sheriff's office, movement near the schoolhouse caught his eye. A figure, unmistakably feminine, was hurrying toward the building, a lantern in hand. Elizabeth. Mason felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. The schoolhouse housed not only teaching materials, but supplies for the town's orphans who sometimes stayed there when temporary arrangements were needed. She must have feared for those supplies when the fire broke out. Without hesitation, Mason changed course, moving swiftly and silently toward the schoolhouse. He had to reach Elizabeth before Turner and his men spotted her. Elizabeth had just unlocked the schoolhouse door when Mason's hand closed gently but firmly around her arm, pulling her into the shadows beside the building. She stifled a gasp of surprise, recognition dawning in her eyes as she made out his features in the dim light. "Mason, what are you—" He pressed a finger to his lips, signaling for silence, then guided her away from the door and deeper into the shadows cast by the large oak tree that shaded the schoolyard. "Turner is here," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant shouts from the livery stable. He and two others, coming in from the west. You need to get back to your home and stay there. For a moment, it seemed Elizabeth would argue, but understanding of the danger quickly replaced the resistance in her expression. She nodded, extinguishing her lantern to avoid drawing attention. The supplies can wait, she agreed, her practical nature asserting itself even in crisis. Mason felt a surge of admiration for her composure. "I'll see you safely home," he said, already calculating the safest route through the back alleys of Redemption Creek. But fate had other plans. A low voice cut through the darkness behind them, freezing them both in place. "Well now, isn't this touching?" The lawman and his lady friend, stealing a moment amidst the chaos. Mason turned slowly, positioning himself between Elizabeth and the source of the voice. Silas Turner stood 20 paces away, a revolver held casually at his side. The years in prison had aged him, his once black hair now streaked with gray, his face gaunt and weathered. But his eyes remained the same, cold, calculating, with a hint of the madness that had always lurked beneath the surface. "Evening, Ranger," Turner said, using Mason's old title deliberately. "Or should I say, Sheriff? Seems you've done well for yourself while I've been enjoying Yuma's hospitality." Mason's hand hovered near his holster, his mind racing to find a way to ensure Elizabeth's safety. "Turner," he acknowledged, his voice betraying none of the tension coiling within him. "You're a long way from Yuma." Turner's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Had some unfinished business with an old acquaintance. 15 years is a long time to plan a reunion." He shifted his gaze to Elizabeth, who stood remarkably steady despite the evident danger. "And who might this lovely lady be? Another schoolteacher, perhaps? You seem to have a type, Ranger." The implication was clear, the threat unmistakable. Mason felt rather than saw Elizabeth stiffen behind him, her breath catching at Turner's words. "This is between you and me, Turner," Mason stated, his voice hard as iron. "Let the lady return to her home, and we'll settle our business like men." Turner seemed to consider this, tilting his head in a parody of thoughtfulness. "I don't think so," he finally replied, his casual tone belied by the dangerous glint in his eyes. "You see, I spent 15 years thinking about how you took everything from me. My freedom, my gang, my future. Seems only fitting that I return the favor before I kill you." He raised his revolver slightly, not quite aiming, but making his intentions clear. "The lady stays. In fact, she's coming with me and the boys. Insurance, you might say, to make sure you follow us out of town for our final reckoning." Mason felt a cold rage building within him, tempered by the fear for Elizabeth's safety. "That's not going to happen," he stated flatly, his hand now resting on the butt of his revolver. Behind Turner, two more figures emerged from the shadows, one unmistakably Henry Wallace with his distinctive walking stick. The other, a younger man Mason didn't recognize. 3 against 1, with Elizabeth caught in the middle. The odds weren't good. "I think it is happening, Sheriff," Turner countered, his revolver now fully raised and aimed at Mason's chest. "Drop your gun belt nice and slow, or the lady gets to see what you look like with a hole where your heart should be." The moment stretched, taut with possibilities, each man calculating moves and countermoves in the deadly chess game that was unfolding. Mason's mind raced, searching for a solution that wouldn't end with Elizabeth in Turner's clutches, or himself dead before he could protect her. The distant sounds of the fire, fighting at the livery stable, had diminished, suggesting the blaze was coming under control. Soon, Jonathan and the others would realize Mason was missing, and begin searching for him, if he could stall long enough. But Turner was nobody's fool. "I'm not a patient man anymore, Ranger," he growled, cocking his revolver with deliberate slowness. "Gun belt, now." With measured movements, Mason began to unbuckle his gun belt, his eyes never leaving Turner's. As he did so, he felt Elizabeth move behind him, her hand briefly touching his back, a gesture of reassurance or farewell. He couldn't tell. What happened next unfolded so quickly that later, Mason would struggle to reconstruct the exact sequence of events. Elizabeth stepped out from behind him, placing herself partially between him and Turner's gun. "Please," she said, her voice steady and clear in the night air, "this doesn't have to end in more bloodshed." Turner's eyes widened slightly in surprise at her boldness. His gun still trained on Mason, but his attention momentarily divided. In that split second of distraction, a shot rang out from the direction of the schoolhouse roof. Henry Wallace cried out, clutching his shoulder as his walking stick clattered to the ground. Turner whirled toward the new threat, firing blindly at the roofline where Jonathan Wells crouched with his rifle. Mason seized the moment, drawing his revolver with the lightning speed that had made him legendary among the Rangers. His first shot caught Turner in the arm, causing the outlaw's next shot to go wild. The third man, the stranger, turned to flee, only to find his path blocked by several townsmen who had heard the gunfire and come running, armed with whatever weapons they could grab. Chaos erupted in the schoolyard. Turner, wounded but dangerous, dove for cover behind the large oak tree, returning fire with his uninjured arm. Mason pushed Elizabeth toward the relative safety of the schoolhouse steps, shielding her with his body as bullets splintered wood around them. "Get inside," he urged, turning back to face Turner even as she scrambled for the door. Jonathan provided covering fire from the roof, keeping Wallace pinned down where he had taken cover behind a water trough. The third man had surrendered to the townspeople, his hands raised in defeat as Thomas Sullivan from the saloon relieved him of his weapons. Turner, realizing his plan had unraveled, emerged from behind the tree with the desperation of a cornered animal. "You've taken everything from me again, Ranger," he shouted, firing wildly in Mason's direction. "But I'll take her from you before I go, just like Rebecca." The mention of Rebecca's name, the threat to Elizabeth, it crystallized something in Mason, burning away the professional detachment he'd maintained for years. His return fire was precise, 3 shots in rapid succession that found their mark in Turner's chest. The outlaw staggered, disbelief crossing his features as he looked down at the spreading crimson stain on his shirt. "Didn't see that coming," he managed, before collapsing face first into the schoolyard dust. The silence that followed seemed to ring in Mason's ears, broken only by the approaching footsteps of Jonathan and the townspeople securing Wallace, who had wisely chosen to surrender rather than share Turner's fate. Mason moved cautiously toward Turner's prone form, kicking the outlaw's revolver well out of reach before kneeling to check for signs of life. There were none. Silas Turner had finally reached the end that had been postponed 15 years ago. A sense of completion washed over Mason. Not satisfaction, not triumph, but the quiet acknowledgement that a chapter that had remained painfully open for too long had finally closed. The schoolhouse door opened behind him, and Elizabeth emerged, her composure remarkable given what she had just experienced. She moved to Mason's side, her gaze taking in the scene. Turner's body, Wallace being restrained, the townspeople gathering with expressions ranging from shock to grim approval. "Is it over?" she asked simply, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Mason nodded, rising to his feet with a weariness that seemed to reach his very bones. "It's over," he confirmed, holstering his revolver with finality. "Turner won't threaten anyone again." As the town doctor arrived to tend to Wallace's shoulder wound and arrangements were made to remove Turner's body to the undertakers, Mason found himself standing apart from the activity, the adrenaline of the confrontation giving way to a hollow feeling he couldn't immediately identify. Elizabeth approached, a blanket someone had given her wrapped around her shoulders against the night chill. "You never told me about Rebecca," she said quietly, no accusation in her tone, only gentle inquiry. Mason hesitated, the name still raw even after 15 years. "She was a schoolteacher," he finally replied, his voice low. "Turner killed her during a bank robbery in Texas. I was there, but I couldn't save her." Understanding dawned in Elizabeth's eyes, understanding of his distance, his protectiveness, the weight he had carried for so long. "That's why you were so concerned about me staying indoors, about the children being safe." It wasn't a question, but Mason nodded confirmation anyway. "I couldn't risk history repeating itself," he admitted, the words difficult to form after years of keeping them buried. Elizabeth's hand found his, her fingers warm against his calloused palm. "Rebecca's death wasn't your failure, Mason," she said with quiet certainty. "Just as my safety tonight wasn't solely your achievement. Jonathan was watching out for both of us from the roof. He told me he'd been trailing you since you left to investigate the Western approach." The revelation surprised Mason, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Jonathan had proven himself an exceptional deputy, anticipating needs and acting on his own initiative when necessary. "Seems I've been underestimating him," Mason acknowledged, making a mental note to commend the young man properly once things had settled. Elizabeth smiled, a small but genuine expression that reached her eyes. "Perhaps you've been underestimating more than just Jonathan," she suggested, her meaning clear in the way her fingers tightened briefly around his. Before Mason could respond, Jonathan himself approached, his rifle slung over his shoulder, and his expression somber despite their victory. "Wallace is talking," the deputy reported. "Says Turner broke out with help from a guard he'd bribed. They've been planning this for months, tracking your movements through letters Wallace sent to contacts in the area." Mason nodded, the pieces falling into place. The careful reconnaissance, the strategic diversion of the fire, it all spoke to the methodical planning that had always made Turner's gang so effective and dangerous. "What about the third man?" he asked, glancing toward where the stranger was being held under guard near the sheriff's office. "Claims he's just hired muscle," Jonathan replied with a shrug. "Didn't even know who you were until Turner explained on the ride in." Dawn was breaking over Redemption Creek by the time statements had been taken. Wallace and the hired gun secured in cells, and Turner's body prepared for burial. Mason stood on the porch of the sheriff's office, watching as the town slowly returned to its normal rhythm. The livery stable had suffered damage, but the fire had been contained before it could spread to adjacent buildings. Repairs would begin today, the owner already assessing the charred timbers with the practical eye of a frontier businessman who had weathered setbacks before. Life in the West continued, resilient and determined, despite the hardships and dangers that were as much a part of the landscape as the mountains and prairies. Elizabeth approached, having returned to her home to change her soot-stained dress for a fresh one of deep blue that complemented her auburn hair. She carried a basket covered with a checkered cloth, the scent of fresh bread wafting from beneath it. "I thought you might be hungry," she said by way of greeting, setting the basket on the bench beside him. "You've been up all night." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Mason more deeply than he could express. For years, he had held himself apart from the connections that made a place home, focused on his duty and the ghosts of his past. Now, standing in the growing light of a new day with Elizabeth beside him, he felt the possibility of something he had long denied himself, a future beyond the badge and gun that had defined him for so long. "Thank you," he said simply, the words encompassing more than just gratitude for the food. Elizabeth seemed to understand, as she so often did, the deeper currents beneath his spare communication. "You know," she began, her gaze following a hawk circling lazily in the morning sky. "When Turner had his gun pointed at us and I stepped forward, he hesitated. There was confusion in his eyes, as if he couldn't reconcile the idea of someone willingly placing themselves in danger for another." Mason had noticed it too, the momentary bewilderment that had given Jonathan the opportunity to take his shot from the schoolhouse roof. Turner never understood that kind of courage, he agreed. To him, people were tools or obstacles, nothing more. Elizabeth turned to face him fully, her expression earnest. "When I said, 'Spare him, please,' to Turner, I saw something flicker in his eyes, recognition, perhaps, of a humanity he had forgotten existed. And when I told him, 'You fear his roar, but I have heard his gentle and truthful voice,' I think for just a moment he glimpsed what you really are beneath the reputation that frightened him so." Mason had been too focused on the tactical situation to fully register her words to Turner at the time, but now they resonated within him, touching on truths he rarely acknowledged even to himself. The fierce protector, the dispenser of frontier justice, these were aspects of who he was, but not the entirety. "You see more in me than most," he said quietly, the admission both uncomfortable and liberating. Elizabeth smiled, the expression warming her eyes. "I see what's there." Mason Blackwood, a man of principle and honor, who carries burdens so others don't have to. A man who could have chosen revenge 15 years ago, but chose justice instead. She gestured toward the town awakening around them, the shopkeepers opening their doors, children beginning to emerge for their delayed trip to the schoolhouse, life reasserting itself after the night's drama. "And I see a man who has given much to this town, but allowed himself to receive little in return." The observation struck closer to home than Mason would have liked to admit. For years, he had maintained a careful distance from the very people he protected, convinced that attachment would compromise his ability to do what needed to be done when hard choices arose. But last night, when Turner had threatened Elizabeth, it wasn't detachment that had steadied his hand. It was the fierce need to protect someone who mattered to him. "Perhaps," he conceded, his voice rough with emotions long suppressed. "It's time for that to change." Elizabeth's smile deepened, understanding and patience in her eyes. "Perhaps it is," she agreed, her hand finding his once more, a point of warmth and connection in the cool morning air. As the sun climbed higher, painting Redemption Creek in hues of gold and amber, Mason Blackwood found himself contemplating a future different from the solitary path he had walked for so long. The weight of Rebecca Collins' death would never fully leave him, nor would the memories of all he had witnessed and done in his years upholding the law on the frontier. But standing beside Elizabeth Montgomery, watching the town they both served in their different ways come to life around them, he felt the possibility of new beginnings, even for a man with as much history as himself. The West was changing, civilization pushing ever forward. But some things remained constant: the need for justice, the value of community, and the healing power of connections forged in even the harshest environments. Jonathan emerged from the sheriff's office, hat in hand, a respectful distance behind them. "Everything's secure, Sheriff," he reported. "Wallace is asking to speak with you when you have time." Mason nodded his acknowledgement, knowing that there would be statements to take, telegrams to send, a trial to prepare for. The work of justice was never truly complete, one case flowing into the next like the endless prairies stretching toward distant horizons. But for this moment, he allowed himself to simply be present, to feel the warmth of Elizabeth's hand in his, and the promise of what might lie ahead for them both. "I'll be there shortly," he told Jonathan, his gaze still on Elizabeth's face. The deputy nodded, a knowing smile briefly crossing his features before he retreated back into the office, leaving them alone once more. In the distance, church bells began to toll, marking the hour and calling the faithful to morning prayers. Prayers of gratitude for dangers averted and lives preserved. Mason Blackwood had never been a religious man, placing his faith in more tangible things: the weight of his revolver, the surety of his own judgment, the immutable laws of action and consequence that governed life on the frontier. But in this moment, with Elizabeth beside him and Redemption Creek stretching before them, bathed in the light of a new day, he found himself experiencing something akin to reverence, gratitude for second chances, and the courage to embrace them. "Shall we?" Elizabeth asked softly, gesturing toward the basket of food she had brought. The simple question contained multitudes, an invitation to share a meal, to share confidences, to step together into whatever the future might hold. Mason Blackwood, who had faced outlaws and killers without flinching, felt a moment's hesitation before the prospect of this new terrain. But only a moment. "Yes," he replied, his voice rough but certain as he covered her hand with his. "I believe we shall." And as they moved toward the bench where the basket waited, Mason felt the final pieces of a long, incomplete puzzle falling into place. Not an ending, but a beginning. Written in the language of second chances that the frontier had always promised to those brave enough to seek them. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.